I'm willing to bet I hold the world record for the most HOA violations resolved in a single afternoon. 139 of them. Gone. Just like that. Poof. So settle in, because this story isn't just about HOA politics. It's about my family's legacy, a lake that was never supposed to exist, an HOA president who thought she was a queen, and the undeniable power of gravity. It all started when the Lakeview Pinnacle Estates Homeowners Association decided to build a vacation village on my property. They thought my lake was their biggest asset. But they were wrong. It was their biggest liability. And they forgot to ask the only question that mattered. Who controls the water? Spoiler alert, me. When they pushed me too far, I simply let it go. My family has owned this land for 5 generations. Not the flashy new money kind of ownership, but the kind forged through dirt under fingernails and hard labor. My great-great-grandfather, Angus Maloud, bought over 2,000 acres of rugged Appalachian hill country that nobody wanted. The land was steep, rocky, and considered useless for farming. But Angus was a civil engineer, and he saw what others missed: water. Specifically, a narrow gorge where 3 large creeks converged. In the 1920s, using his own money, his own hands, and a small crew of local workers, Angus built a dam. Not a massive Hoover-style concrete wall, but an over-engineered cyclopean masonry dam crafted from stone quarried directly from the land. The dam created a 700-acre lake where once there had only been a muddy valley. He named it Loch Maloud. On a high bluff overlooking the water, he built a lodge of stone and timber. That's where I live today. The dam wasn't built for beauty alone. It was a feat of engineering, designed for flood control and even potential hydroelectric power, though the turbines were never installed. For generations, my family were the quiet custodians of this land and lake. We paid taxes, maintained the dam, and enjoyed the solitude. The deed was ironclad, and more importantly, so were the riparian rights. The dam, the lake bed, and every drop of water belonged to the Maloud Trust, my trust. Fast forward 3 years ago. The world finally discovered our quiet corner of the mountains. A slick developer called Pinnacle Living bought a 1,000-acre parcel next to ours, land my family had reluctantly sold back in the 1970s to pay estate taxes. The developer carved it into a luxury gated community called Lakeview Pinnacle Estates. At first, I didn't mind. People can live where they want. I was just the quiet man in the stone lodge on the hill. But then came Karen. Her real name was Brenda McLaughlin, but Karen suited her perfectly. She was the inaugural HOA president, late 50s, always in expensive resort wear, driving a white Escalade, pretending the Appalachian foothills were Palm Beach. She had the brittle kind of smile that never reached her eyes. To her, my family's land wasn't history. It was an amenity waiting to be monetized. And she believed my lake, Loch Maloud, was the jewel in her crown. First came the newsletters. We remind all residents to enjoy the beautiful community lake responsibly. Then came the emails addressed directly to me. The HOA board has noticed your personal dock is in need of aesthetic updating. Please see attached bylaws for approved color palettes. I replied politely, reminding her that the HOA's jurisdiction ended exactly at my property line, clearly marked and recorded. My dock was my business. That was the moment the gauntlet was thrown. Brenda's entire identity was built on unquestioned authority. The idea that a scruffy bachelor in his 40s, living in an old stone house, could defy her? Unthinkable. She saw me as a man who'd inherited land he didn't deserve. What she didn't see was a hydrological engineer who had spent his entire life studying, maintaining, and understanding the dam she took for granted. She underestimated me. That was her first mistake. Her second mistake was far bigger. It involved 139 cabins, a fraudulent survey, and a complete disregard for both man-made law and natural law. And it was a mistake that would force me to teach her a very expensive, very wet lesson in property rights. The escalation began, as these things often do, with a simple fence. I had the entire 2,000-acre parcel properly resurveyed, marking the boundary every few hundred feet with iron pins and bright orange flags, especially along the border with Lakeview Pinnacle Estates. I wasn't being aggressive. I was being precise. I've always believed in the old saying that good fences make good neighbors. Brenda, however, seemed to believe that good neighbors were the kind who handed over their property for her convenience. Her first major move was to announce the creation of a Lakeview Community Recreation Area. In the monthly HOA newsletter, she unveiled a beautifully drawn map showing a sandy beach, a fishing pier, a volleyball court, and a kayak launch. It was a nice plan, except for one small detail. Every bit of it was on my land. I sent her a cease and desist letter through my lawyer, a calm and professional document that included a copy of my recent survey. It laid out with crystal clarity exactly where the property lines fell. Brenda's response was dismissive. She claimed there was a discrepancy in the surveys and that the HOA was relying on their own, more recent plat map. That was the first I'd heard of such a thing. I drove down to the county records office, and sure enough, there it was, a newly filed survey map for Lakeview Pinnacle Estates. It was a masterpiece of subtle forgery. The boundary line had been shifted ever so slightly, jogging outward a few hundred feet along the entire lakefront, just enough to absorb 50 acres of my shoreline, including the cove where she planned her recreation area. The document bore an official seal, but I knew it was wrong. My family's deeds stretched back a century, and they told a different story. So I did what I do best. I dug in. I'm an engineer, and I live for data. I pulled the original 1920s deeds, the 1970s sale documents, and my own modern survey. Then I spent an entire weekend with my GPS rover, reshooting every boundary marker myself. The result was a point cloud of data, accurate down to the centimeter, proving beyond a doubt that the HOA's map was a complete fiction. The real kicker came when I investigated the surveyor listed on their plat. The man had lost his license 2 years earlier for falsifying documents in a zoning case. He was legally barred from submitting any plans at all. That was my smoking gun. I compiled everything into a neat, damning report and sent it to Brenda and the HOA board through my lawyer. Naively, I thought the proof of fraud would end the matter. I expected a retraction, maybe even an apology. But I had once again underestimated her ego. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended as an amused observer, Brenda held up my report and dismissed it as a campaign of harassment by a disgruntled local. She waved her fraudulent map in the air and declared, "This is our community. This is our lake. We will not be bullied." The homeowners, most of whom just wanted peace and quiet, applauded dutifully. Her board of yes men nodded in solemn agreement. They voted to proceed with construction immediately. The bulldozers arrived the following Monday. I stood on my porch and filmed as they crossed my property line, tearing up soil and toppling 100-year-old oak trees. I called the sheriff. When a young deputy arrived, he found himself caught in the middle. Brenda and her slick lawyer shoved their forged map in his face, while I presented my authentic survey. He looked from one to the other, then sighed. "Sir, ma'am," he said, "this is a civil dispute. It's a property line disagreement. You'll have to take it to court." And that was exactly what Brenda was counting on. Litigation takes years and costs a fortune. She was betting I didn't have the stomach or the resources to fight her machine. She was wrong again. I filed for an immediate injunction, but the court's docket was packed. The soonest we could get a hearing was 6 months away. To Brenda, that was all the opportunity she needed. She believed possession was 10/10ths of the law, and in that 6-month window she didn't just build a beach, she went for the jackpot. She announced Phase 2, the Pinnacle Cabins, an exclusive collection of luxury waterfront rentals, 139 of them. These weren't simple shacks. They were prefabricated, high-end cabins with plumbing, electricity, and HVAC units, all set on concrete slab foundations. Her gamble was simple. By the time we got to court, the cabins would be a fait accompli. No judge, she believed, would order the demolition of a multi-million-dollar development. It was bold. It was reckless. And it was the beginning of the end for her. Because while Brenda was obsessed with bulldozers and concrete, I was focused on something older, more powerful, and written into the fine print of a deed signed nearly 100 years ago. She was building on the shores of Loch Mlaud. She had forgotten one critical truth. The loch answered to me. The construction was a whirlwind of noise, dust, and arrogance. Every morning, I watched a convoy of trucks rumble past the turnoff to my lodge, spewing clouds of dirt into the air. They worked with startling speed, a testament to what you can accomplish when you ignore small inconveniences like permits, environmental reviews, and property rights. In no time, the cabins began sprouting like ugly rectangular mushrooms along my shoreline. 139 of them crammed close together. Each had a tiny deck facing the water, a parody of the nature they claimed to celebrate. Brenda was everywhere during construction. She patrolled the site from the seat of a golf cart like a queen surveying her empire. Often she'd drive to the edge nearest my house and stop, staring up at my lodge with a smug little smile. It was a daily, silent taunt. Her posture screamed, "See, I'm winning! What are you going to do about it, Mr. Mlaud?" What I was doing was spending my days in my great-grandfather's study and my nights in the pump house at the base of the dam. The study was a treasure trove of history. Angus Mlaud had been a meticulous record keeper. I found his original blueprints for the dam, complete with hand-penned calculations on flow rates, spillway capacity, and structural tolerances. But the real prize was hidden in his journal, dated 1928. In one passage, Angus wrote, "The lake reaches its fullest extent at an elevation of 1,145 feet above sea level. This is the natural high water mark dictated by the topography of the valley. For safety and recreational purposes, I have engineered the primary sluice gates to maintain the water level at a constant 1,138 feet. However, the structure and spillway are fully capable of withstanding the natural maximum of 1,145 feet in the event of a generational flood. 7 feet. That was the magic number. A 7-foot buffer engineered by Angus as a safety margin. 7 vertical feet between the current, artificially maintained lake level and the true natural shoreline. 7 feet of pure, liquid justice. I pulled out my topographical maps and survey data. My own land, including the lodge, was safely above the 1,850-foot contour line. But the stolen 50 acres, the land where Brenda's cabins were sprouting, was a different story. The lowest cabins sat at 1,139 feet. The highest barely touched 1,844. Every single one of them nestled neatly within the 7-foot buffer zone. In other words, they weren't on prime lakefront property. They were sitting in the lakebed. Next, I turned my attention to the dam itself. I had maintained it my whole life, just as my father had before me. Its mechanics were elegantly simple, a testament to 1920s engineering. The 2 main sluice gates were controlled by massive 36-inch cast-iron wheels in the dry gallery, a concrete tunnel running through the heart of the dam. Turning those wheels was no small task. Hundreds of rotations were required to raise or lower the gates. The design was deliberate, slow, ponderous, and utterly unstoppable. I spent a week in that tunnel inspecting every gear, greasing every fitting, and checking every seal. Everything was in perfect order. The dam was ready, a silent giant waiting for a command. Meanwhile, the HOA was pouring concrete. I was gathering ammunition. I set up time-lapse cameras to document the construction. I flew a drone weekly to capture high-resolution aerial shots that clearly showed the cabins rising well below the 1,845-foot contour line, which I carefully marked on the images. I filed a report with the State Department of Environmental Quality documenting the lack of erosion control, the destruction of riparian buffers, and the risk of septic contamination from unpermitted cabins. The department issued Brenda a violation notice. She ignored it without hesitation. She felt untouchable. Her lawyers buried my injunction in paperwork, delaying every step. She believed the system would protect her. But Brenda misunderstood something vital. I had access to a system far older and far more powerful than the courts. The final piece of the puzzle was legal certainty. I needed to be absolutely sure my actions were defensible. My lawyer, Sam, an old country attorney with a sharp mind, nearly dropped his spectacles when I told him my plan. "You want to do what?" he asked. I laid everything out for him. The deeds, the riparian rights proving my ownership of the lake bed up to the natural high water mark, Angus's journal, the survey data. It was all airtight. The deed explicitly granted me the right to raise the water level to its natural maximum for dam maintenance and safety. Sam's skepticism turned into a slow smile. Together, we drafted a letter. It was a masterpiece of legal prose. The letter informed Lakeview Pinnacle Estates HOA that they had illegally constructed 139 structures within the designated flood easement of Loch Malaud Dam. It further stated that, for urgent and necessary structural inspections, as recommended by a licensed hydrological engineer, me, the lake would soon be returned to its natural maximum elevation of 1,845 feet above sea level. The notice gave them 48 hours. That was it. 2 days to evacuate personnel and remove property from the clearly marked easement zone. The letter was sent certified mail, signature required. I knew Brenda would sign for it. I could picture the smirk on her face as she read it, scoffing before tossing it straight into the trash. Just another harassment letter from the man up the hill, and that's exactly what she did. The very next morning, instead of clearing out, they doubled down. Trucks arrived with furniture, workers unloaded pallets, and the cabins were dressed like stage props. Curtains went up in the windows. Firewood was stacked neatly on porches that wouldn't be dry much longer. The entire scene had an almost theatrical quality, like the set of a disaster movie, waiting for the first act to begin. When the 48 hours were up, the morning was calm and gray. Mist hovered low across the water, muting every sound. At 9 o'clock sharp, the exact moment the deadline expired, I drove down to the dam. A thermos of coffee sat beside me, classic rock hummed from a speaker, and the weight of grim, methodical purpose pressed on my shoulders. Before I began, I made 2 calls. The first was to the sheriff's office. I told the dispatcher in my calmest voice that as the legal owner and operator of Loch Malaud Dam, I was commencing a standard maintenance procedure. The lake level, I explained, would be raised gradually to its natural high water mark of 1,145 feet over the next 12 to 24 hours. I made sure to note that all property owners had been informed in writing. The dispatcher sounded confused, but logged the call. The second call was to Sam, my lawyer. "It's time," I said. "Godspeed," he replied. "The injunction paperwork will be ready Monday, but I don't think we'll need it." Then I went to work. Inside the dam's cool, echoing gallery, the air smelled of damp stone and machine oil. I approached the first massive wheel. the north gate's control. My hands gripped the cold iron, my chest tightened, and then I began to turn. At first, the wheel resisted, stiff from decades of rest. But with a groan of metal, the gearing system shuddered to life. The vibration ran up through my boots as the indicator needle crept from closed toward open. Somewhere deep beneath the water, a steel gate, tons of metal, shifted inch by inch. Flow slowed. The balance changed. I moved to the south. Gate repeated the process, and for the next 3 hours I rotated between the two wheels, turn after turn, following the precise sequence written in my great-grandfather's notes. I wasn't breaking the dam. I wasn't sabotaging anything. The structure was doing exactly what it was designed to do, obeying a new command. With each partial closure, the 3 creeks feeding the lake delivered more water than the gates released. Slowly, almost invisibly, the lake began to rise. By noon, I climbed to my promontory near the lodge, binoculars in hand. At first, the difference was subtle. The water, which normally sat 20 feet away from the new cabins, was now kissing the edge of their freshly laid turf. An hour later, it swallowed the yards entirely, lapping at the concrete slabs. The workers noticed first. They stood in a cluster, pointing, one man stepping into the shallows before shrugging at his foreman. They thought it was a fluke, some harmless fluctuation. But by mid-afternoon, their shrugs turned to alarm. Phones came out, arms waved, panic spread like fire in dry grass. Board members arrived to inspect. Then, finally, Brenda's white Escalade rolled onto the site. She climbed out, hands planted firmly on her hips, fury radiating from her posture. To her, this was a stunt, some plumbing trick, some temporary inconvenience. She stomped toward the rising water, her expensive sandals sinking into soggy turf. But the water didn't pause. It didn't flinch. It kept climbing, steady and unstoppable. By 4 o'clock. The lowest cabins stood like islands, water lapping halfway up their doors. Porch lights flickered, sparked, and died as circuits drowned. Pallets of building material floated off like makeshift rafts. I watched through my scope, silent as the biblical image unfolded below. Nature wasn't raging. It was calmly, methodically reclaiming what was hers. This wasn't a flood. It was an eviction. By evening, the water had risen nearly 5 feet. 4 full rows of cabins were submerged to their windows, drywall dissolving, furniture floating inside like wreckage. Even the highest cabins stood knee-deep in murky water. Brenda's multi-million-dollar dream was reduced to a waterlogged ruin in a single day. My phone began to buzz just as the sheriff's deputy, the same one from the boundary dispute, pulled up to the end of my driveway. Brenda arrived in a frenzy, her voice cracking with rage as she pointed up toward my lodge. "He's flooding us out! He's destroying our property! Arrest him!" she shrieked, her whole body trembling with fury. The deputy, looking weary and unconvinced, made his way up to my porch. I greeted him calmly, handed him a cold bottle of water, and invited him inside for a full tour. I laid everything out with precision. First, I showed him the certified mail receipt, proof that Brenda and her board had received my 48-hour notice. Next, I presented my great-grandfather's original blueprints, the deed that confirmed my riparian rights, and the operational manual that detailed the exact procedure I was following to raise the lake to the documented 1,845-foot high water mark. I explained that I was not only the dam's legal operator, but also an engineer carrying out a long-overdue structural integrity test, something I was both obligated and fully entitled to do. Then I pointed toward the half-submerged cabins. "Deputy," I said evenly, "all I see out there is an unauthorized debris field, illegally dumped in my lake's flood easement. I gave them notice. They chose to ignore it." The deputy studied my documentation carefully. Then his eyes shifted toward Brenda, who by now was nearly incoherent with anger, her face contorted in a mix of panic and denial. Slowly, I watched the truth dawn on him. This wasn't a criminal act. It was a self-inflicted disaster. He walked back down to her and, for the second time, told her this was a civil matter. The look on her face, lit by the flashing patrol lights, was a perfect storm of impotent rage and dawning horror. What followed was a slow-motion collapse of finances and reputations. The investors behind Pinnacle Living, who had fueled Brenda's reckless expansion, were horrified when they realized what had happened. Their insurance company wasted no time in denying the claim, citing the fraudulent survey, lack of permits, and blatant construction within a documented flood easement. They labeled it gross negligence. The homeowners of Lakeview Pinnacle Estates, who had paid top dollar for their so-called luxury cabins, now found themselves facing a swamp of rotting, half-drowned structures. Their HOA president had led them straight into ruin. The lawsuits began to fly, class actions against Brenda, the HOA, the developers, the construction company, and even the surveyor who had long since disappeared. Brenda's empire crumbled overnight. She was humiliatingly voted out in an emergency meeting. Within a week, her white Escalade was seen leaving the gated community for the last time. The HOA went bankrupt under the weight of litigation. The developers cut their losses, selling the remaining land for pennies on the dollar to a conservation trust. But my work wasn't done. I left the lake at the 1,845-foot mark for an entire month. I wanted the water to do its work, to saturate every joint, warp every board, and leave behind a permanent layer of silt and decay. Only when I was satisfied did I return to the dam, and over the course of 12 hours, slowly lower the water back to its normal level of 1,138 feet. The sight that emerged was devastating. 139 cabins stood ruined. Mold clung to the walls, windows were shattered, and a foul stench lingered in the air. With no one left to salvage them, the cabins were abandoned. I took matters into my own hands. I hired demolition crews and salvage workers. For nearly a year, we dismantled and hauled away the wreckage. The cost was enormous, but I offset it by selling scrap materials and securing a major court judgment against the developer's parent company for trespass and damages. Once the land was cleared, I hired a landscape architect who specialized in ecological restoration. Together, we replanted the 50-acre shoreline with native trees, shrubs, and grasses. Slowly, the lake reclaimed its natural beauty. Within 2 years, you couldn't even tell the cabins had ever been there. The oaks returned, birds filled the air again, and the quiet peace of Loch Mlaud was restored. Sometimes members of the reorganized and chastened HOA paddle by in their canoes, waving up at my lodge. They know the story. They know who owns the lake. They know who controls the water. I never sought to be a villain or a hero. I simply wanted to protect the land my family had cherished for over a century. Brenda and her followers mistook my patience for weakness, and they paid the price. They learned the hard way that some lines should never be crossed, and that nature, when properly guided, is the ultimate arbiter of justice. And that is how I solved 139 HOA violations in one stroke.